Now, if you're completely new to photography and filming, let me give you a brief explanation of what ISO is. ISO is the sensitivity of the camera, and you can manually set that to different points. In the old days, it was like film stock. A slow film stock, or let's say 100 ISO, had a very small fine grain and needed a lot of light to hit it to gain an exposure. Whereas an ISO of 1600 would have very large halides on the film grain and therefore require less light to make those halides come to life. So ISO in a digital camera is like your old film stock. You want a higher number ISO when there's not very much light in the room, and you want a much lower ISO number when there's lots of light, for example, if you're shooting outdoors. And this is just the digital equivalent. The difference is, instead of having to carry lots of different types of film, you can program in exactly the number you need depending on where you're filming and what you're filming. The ISO range of this camera is from 100 ISO to 12,800 ISO in 1/3 stop increments. Now you can shoot at a maximum of 25,600 ISO, which is H mode. Now, to be honest, this isn't going to look very good, but if you absolutely need to see something where there's very, very minimal light, this will give you an image of sorts. To access the higher ISO settings, you have to go into the red camera menus, submenu 2, and scroll down to ISO speed settings. Now down to ISO speed range, and select your minimum ISO and your maximum ISO within the ISO speed range. Once you've done that, click OK. Now when you go to your ISO settings, you can select the higher ISOs. First of all, we're looking at 12,800 ISO, then 16,000, 20,000 and 25,600. When you punch in 5 times and 10 times, you can see at 25,000 ISO there's a lot of extra noise visible. To reduce noise when working at the higher ISOs, you can engage higher ISO speed noise reduction. There are 3 settings: low, standard and high, or you can disable it altogether. Let's start with the high setting and look at 16,000 ISO as a starting point. This will give us a good indication of how the other noise will look. At 16,000 ISO, this is with ISO noise reduction switched on. Notice how the image changes in the shadow area when you switch the noise reduction off and then on again. I'll leave you to decide what you prefer. When you're in highlight tone priority mode, the minimum ISO is only 200. Now, what is highlight tone priority? Well, there was much discussion of this in our 5D Mark II DVD, and at that time, we encouraged you to use highlight tone priority to stretch the ability of the camera to record into the highlights of an image. That is true, but it does increase noise into your image. And we've subsequently discovered that actually shooting with highlight tone priority off gives you a cleaner image. In this scene, we have a very high contrast situation with a very bright light in the fish tank fading into black within the shadow areas of the frame. And this is with highlight tone priority switched to off. If we now switch highlight tone priority on, the D+ symbol will appear in the bottom of the frame. This is highlight tone priority switched on at 6400 ISO. So in effect, this should bring more information into the highlight areas of the scene, in this case, the fish tank. Here's the shot switched on, and here it is switched off. I can't see a massive difference. Here it is on, and here is a side-by-side with it both off and on. I'm not convinced that it makes a dramatic difference, but I do think it increases noise in the shadows. But what it does is it essentially stretches the higher end of the dynamic range, which is why you lose some of the bottom end. And to be honest, when these cameras are sensitive as they are, even at 200, I would prefer to have a lower ISO and control my lighting in other ways. So that's my advice. You may choose to do it differently, but please don't get hung up on it. So how do you set ISO? Well, again, you can do this one of three ways. The simplest way, and I guess the most photographically familiar way, is simply to press the ISO button up here and use this dial to dial in the ISO that you want. Very, very straightforward. Now, in terms of movie shooting, we advise certain ISOs to be cleaner than others. These ISOs are 160 ISO, 320 ISO, 640 ISO, and 1250 ISO. It's been determined that the other ISOs are derived from algorithmic values of those core 4 minimum levels. And so if you shoot at those levels, you will get a much cleaner image when shooting video. Now in live view mode, in movie mode, when you hit the ISO button, it will also show up on the rear display, and therefore you get a visual representation on the LCD as well as on the top screen there. So there's two ways to view it. Now, as a stills photographer, you may use auto ISO in stills mode, and you can get away with it because if the scene is well illuminated, then you don't necessarily see the noise. What you want to avoid in movie mode is when you're shooting one scene to another, is different levels of gain or ISO being present in the scene, because then what you'll end up with is different noise levels from one shot to another, and you'll lose that consistency. When shooting movie mode, it's always about consistency. You want to keep everything as consistent as you possibly can from one shot to the next. When you start on a master shot using auto ISO, the camera will overcompensate for the dark areas of the scene, and so what you're seeing is excessive noise in the shadows and the fish tank is blown out. When you cut to the mid shot, the ISO adjusts to get what it thinks is a good exposure. And then on the close-up, it adjusts again and pushes the ISO down because of the light available, and the image will appear cleaner, and as a result, the blacks will look blacker. Each shot in isolation looks okay, but when you cut back to the master shot, you'll find that there will be differences in the noise and it will look unnatural. In the next shot, I'm going to actually move the camera with auto ISO engaged. As the camera tilts down, notice how the harsh effect on the shadows is on the left-hand side of frame as the auto ISO adjusts and crushes down the blacks in a fairly crude fashion. Now, this is not something you ever want to use in a filming environment. You want to set your ISO manually and let the areas of the scene that are dark stay dark. Now, to illustrate this point, in this next shot, I've fixed the ISO at 3200. Now, I've had to lower the iris to f4, and of course, we're shooting at 1/50th of a second. Now, when I do a camera move, what you'll notice is the shadow areas of the room remain dark, which is what you want for creative effect. You don't want the ISO to be automatically adjusting while you develop a shot. So you go from darkness, and when you move the camera down, what you'll see is it comes into light, but the shadow areas of the scene remain dark. Now, if the information in the room was important and you wanted to shoot at, say, 12,800 ISO, well, as the camera tilts down, you won't get that effect of the rest of the room darkening down to compensate for the change in light level. It will remain constant, but you will find that the fish tank will be overexposed. So you have to decide what's important. The simple rule of thumb to remember with ISO in filmmaking is that the higher the ISO, the more noise or the more grain you will see, and therefore your picture will stop looking as pin sharp and as contrasty. Whereas at the lower end, at the lower ISOs, you'll get finer detail, greater contrast and less noise.